Some of the greatest voices in the world went silent too soon. Tonight, we're going to find out where 30 of them really rest. Not the tribute stones, not the memorials, the actual graves. Some are grand. Some are unmarked. A few are places no fan will ever be allowed to visit. Let's begin. Our first stop is not, technically, a grave at all. It is a garden behind a white-columned mansion on the south side of Memphis, Tennessee. The mansion is called Graceland, and it sits on a rise above what was once U.S. Route 51 and is now called Elvis Presley Boulevard. The garden is called the Meditation Garden. It is a small semicircle of flagstones with a fountain at the center, 4 Grecian columns, and a stained glass window depicting the meditation garden itself in miniature. It is one of the most visited spots in the American South, and under a bronze marker in the ground at the front of the semicircle lies Elvis Aaron Presley. You know the outline of the story. The truck driver from Tupelo, the kid who walked into Sun Studio in 1954 at 18 years old and cut a record that changed the sound of American music. The 4 appearances on Ed Sullivan, the Army years in Germany, Priscilla, the Hollywood pictures, the comeback special in 1968, the Vegas years, the jumpsuits, the prescription drug dependencies that his personal physician, Dr. George Nichopoulos, later admitted had gotten wildly out of hand. What most people do not know is that Elvis Presley's original grave was not at Graceland. When he died on the 16th of August 1977, at age 42, of what was ruled cardiac arrhythmia complicated by prescription drug intake, he was buried 3 days later at Forest Hill Cemetery in Memphis, in a mausoleum crypt next to his mother, Gladys, who had died in 1958 of heart failure at 46. His father, Vernon, chose the plot. It was a nice mausoleum. It should have been the end of the story. It was not. On the night of the 29th of August, 1977, 13 days after Elvis was buried, 3 men were arrested at Forest Hill Cemetery in the middle of an attempted body theft. Their apparent plan was to steal Elvis Presley's coffin, transport it to an undisclosed location, and demand a $10 million ransom. The police had been tipped off. The men were arrested before they got the crypt open. The charges were later dropped for lack of evidence that they had actually intended to complete the theft, and the whole affair became one of the strangest footnotes in music history. Vernon Presley did not wait for a second attempt. He petitioned the city of Memphis for permission to exhume both Elvis and Gladys and move them to the grounds of Graceland itself, where the Presley family could guard them around the clock. Permission was granted on the 2nd of October 1977, on the grounds of public safety. Elvis and Gladys were disinterred and reburied in the meditation garden that Elvis had built years earlier as a place of quiet reflection. Today, 4 members of the Presley family lie in the meditation garden. Elvis is on the left. His mother Gladys is beside him. His father Vernon, who died of heart failure in 1979, is next. His grandmother Minnie Mae, who died in 1980 at 89, is at the far right. There is also a small marker for Elvis's stillborn twin brother, Jesse Garon Presley, who died at birth in 1935 in Tupelo. Jesse's actual body was buried in Tupelo and was never moved. The stone at Graceland is a memorial only. In 2020, Lisa Marie Presley's son, Benjamin Keogh, who took his own life at 27, was buried in the meditation garden as well. And in January 2023, Lisa Marie herself, who died of a cardiac arrest at 54, joined her son. There is a persistent rumor, still active among a subculture of Elvis fans who call themselves Alivers, that the man in the Graceland grave is not actually Elvis Presley. They cite the misspelling on the original tombstone. The name on the marker reads Elvis Aaron Presley, spelled with 2 A's. His birth certificate spelled it Aaron, with 1. Alivers argue that Elvis, who was reportedly obsessive about the details of his own name, would never have allowed a misspelling on his own grave, and that the spelling change is a coded signal that the body in the ground is a decoy. The more likely explanation is that Elvis himself, in his later years, had begun using the spelling Aaron with 2 A's, considering it the more traditional biblical form of the name, and that his father Vernon simply used the spelling Elvis had preferred. But the Aliver community has never accepted this. Some of them believe Elvis is alive. Some believe he faked his death to escape the pressures of fame. The king, in a certain very real sense, has never been allowed to rest. The meditation garden is open to the public every morning at Graceland for what the estate calls the morning walk-up. It is free. You can visit any day of the year, in the hour before Graceland officially opens. Thousands come every August 16, on the anniversary of his death, for the annual candlelight vigil. Fans line up along the driveway. They walk past the graves in silence, carrying candles. Some of them weep. Some of them touch the flat marker. Some of them leave notes. He is not really buried alone. His mother is with him, and his father, and his grandmother, and now his daughter and grandson. But when you stand at the front of that semicircle in the morning, before the crowds arrive, the ground under your feet is one of the loneliest places in American music history. The king who filled arenas, alone in a small garden behind his own house. Forever. We travel now more than 1,000 miles east, to a small town called Meridian, Mississippi. Meridian is a place most Americans have never been and cannot find on a map. It sits about halfway between Jackson and Birmingham on Interstate 20, an old railroad town that grew up around the junction of several major lines in the late 19th century. And at Oak Grove Cemetery on 8th Street, in a modest family plot, lies the man who essentially invented country music, Jimmie Rodgers, the singing brakeman. He was born in 1897, either in Meridian itself or in the nearby community of Pine Springs, depending on which biographer you believe. His father worked on the Mobile and Ohio Railroad. His mother died of tuberculosis when Jimmie was 6 or 7. He was passed around among relatives for years and essentially raised himself. He got his first job on the railroad at 13, working as a water boy, and by the time he was 20, he was a brakeman on the New Orleans and Northeastern line. He also had tuberculosis, contracted somewhere along the way, though the diagnosis would not come until years later. He played guitar and sang all his life. He learned blues from the black railroad workers he worked alongside and country ballads from the white workers, and he mixed the two in a way nobody had quite done before. His voice had a mournful clarity to it, and he had developed a distinctive yodel, a blue yodel, that let him extend his phrases in a way that sounded like nothing else on the radio. In August 1927, at the age of 30, Jimmie Rodgers made his way to Bristol, Tennessee, for what was being advertised as a talent audition. The producer, Ralph Peer, working for the Victor Talking Machine Company, had set up temporary recording equipment in a warehouse and was auditioning anyone who wanted to try. Rodgers arrived and cut 2 songs. So did another group, the Carter Family, from Poor Valley, Virginia. Those recording sessions in Bristol are now considered the founding moment of commercial country music. Over the next 6 years, Jimmie Rodgers recorded 110 songs. He became, briefly, one of the biggest recording stars in America. Blue Yodel, T for Texas, Waiting for a Train, In the Jailhouse Now. He sold millions of records at a time when radio was still relatively new and the record industry was still figuring out what it was. He made about $100,000 in his short career, which in 1930 was a fortune, though his father and various hangers-on took most of it. Tuberculosis was killing him the whole time. He recorded some of his greatest songs while spitting blood into a bucket between takes. He had hemorrhages on stage. He performed anyway. He knew he did not have long, and he seemed determined to leave as much music behind as he could. In May 1933, Jimmie Rodgers went to New York City for what turned out to be his final recording sessions. He was so weak that a cot was set up in the studio so he could rest between takes. He recorded 12 songs over 4 days. On the 26th of May 1933, alone in his room at the Taft Hotel in New York, he suffered a massive lung hemorrhage and died. He was 35 years old. His body was brought back to Meridian by train. Thousands of people met the train at the station. He was buried at Oak Grove Cemetery in a plot that had been prepared for him. His grave here is a modest affair, a rectangular concrete slab with his name carved into it, and beside it a small stone marker in the shape of a guitar. His widow, Carrie, who outlived him by 28 years, is buried beside him. So is his daughter Anita, who died in infancy in 1938. The Meridian Railroad Museum, a few blocks away, has a Jimmie Rodgers Memorial Museum inside it with his guitar, some of his records, and various pieces of memorabilia. The city holds a Jimmie Rodgers Festival every May, but the grave itself, at Oak Grove, is quiet. Very few visitors make the trip to Meridian to see it. Country music historians know he is here. Serious fans know. But the tourists who come to Nashville to visit the Country Music Hall of Fame, or who come to Memphis to visit Graceland, almost never make the 2-hour detour to a small industrial town in eastern Mississippi to see the grave of the man who essentially invented the entire genre. He was the first artist inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 1961. He has been dead for more than 90 years, and his grave is one of the quietest important spots in American music. Our next stop is a small parish churchyard in the village of Tanworth-in-Arden in Warwickshire, England, about 12 miles south of Birmingham. Street moment is miles. Mary Magdalene Church is a medieval Anglican church of the type you find in villages across the English Midlands. The graveyard is small. Most of the graves belong to local families who have lived in Tanworth-in-Arden for centuries. And under a simple flat stone in the shadow of an old oak tree lies Nick Drake. He was born in Rangoon, Burma, in June 1948. His father was an engineer for the Bombay-Burma Trading Corporation. The family moved back to England in 1950 when Nick was 2, and he grew up in Tanworth-in-Arden itself, in a large house called Farleys that his parents had bought. He was educated at Marlborough College, the same public school that produced the singer Chris de Burgh and the actor James Mason. He learned piano as a child and picked up guitar as a teenager. He went up to Cambridge in 1967 to read English at Fitzwilliam College. He did not finish. He had discovered folk music, and specifically the alternate tunings that guitarists like Bert Jansch and John Renbourn were using in the London folk scene, and he was writing his own songs at a pace that made continuing his degree seem impossible. In 1968, at age 20, Nick Drake was signed by Joe Boyd, an American producer who was working in London and who had signed several important British folk acts. Boyd introduced him to the arranger Robert Kirby, who was also a student at Cambridge, and the two of them worked out a way to blend Nick's finger-picked guitar with lush string arrangements. Nick's first album, 5 Leaves Left, was released in 1969. His second, Brighter Later, came in 1970. His third, Pink Moon, came in 1972. None of the 3 albums sold well during his lifetime. 5 Leaves Left sold about 5,000 copies. Brighter Later did marginally better. Pink Moon, which he had recorded in 2 nights at Sound Technique's studio in London with no producer and no accompaniment except his own voice and guitar, sold fewer than 4,000 copies in its first year. Nick Drake did almost no promotion. He gave perhaps 3 interviews in his life. He performed live only a handful of times, and he was reportedly so uncomfortable on stage that some of the concerts became legendary for the wrong reasons. He would sit down, tune his guitar for several minutes in silence, play a song without acknowledging the audience, and then tune again for several minutes before starting the next song. His live career effectively ended after a disastrous show at Ewell Technical College in 1970, during which he walked off the stage midway through his set. He moved back to his parents' house in Tanworth-in-Arden. He suffered from severe depression that had been building for years. His parents watched him deteriorate and did not know what to do. He was seeing a psychiatrist. He had been prescribed an antidepressant called Triptizol, which was the British trade name for the drug amitriptyline. On the morning of the 25th of November, 1974, Nick Drake's mother Molly found him dead in his bedroom at Farleys. He was 26 years old. The autopsy determined that he had died of an overdose of amitriptyline. He had ingested approximately 30 pills. The coroner ruled it a suicide, though his parents always believed it was accidental. There was no note. He was buried 3 days later in the churchyard of St. Mary Magdalene, in the shadow of the oak tree that stands beside the church. His parents chose a spot they thought he would have liked. His grave was small and unadorned for years. The story does not end there, and this is one of the great posthumous rediscoveries in the history of popular music. In 1985, a small English record label re-released Nick Drake's 3 albums as a boxed set called Fruit Tree. It sold modestly, but it introduced him to a new generation of listeners. In 1999, Volkswagen used the title track of Pink Moon in a television commercial for the Cabrio convertible. The song became, briefly, one of the most searched tracks in the early days of the commercial internet. Within a year, Pink Moon had sold more copies than it had in the previous 27 years combined. Nick Drake became one of the most influential figures in what would come to be called the singer-songwriter revival of the early 2000s. Today his grave is one of the most visited spots in the English Midlands. Fans come from all over the world, from Japan, from South America, from Australia. They leave flowers, guitar picks, and handwritten notes. Some of them leave copies of his 3 albums, propped against the base of the stone. The stone itself is a modest slab of brown granite. It gives his name and his dates. Below the dates is a line from the final song on Pink Moon, which he called From the Morning. The line reads, "Now we rise, and we are everywhere." The oak tree still stands over the grave. His parents, Rodney and Molly, are buried nearby. His sister Gabrielle, the actress who appeared in the James Bond film On Her Majesty's Secret Service, has spoken movingly about his death for many years and has been the primary keeper of his legacy. She is still living at the time of this recording. We travel now to a very different kind of resting place. We are going to Père Lachaise Cemetery in the 20th arrondissement of Paris. This is one of the great cemeteries of the world. It sits on 110 acres in the northeastern part of the city, and it holds more than 1 million bodies. Chopin is buried here. Oscar Wilde is buried here. Edith Piaf is buried here. Molière is buried here. And in Division 6, in a plot that is now surrounded by a metal barrier because visitors were becoming a genuine problem for the cemetery, lies Jim Morrison. He was born James Douglas Morrison in Melbourne, Florida, on the 8th of December, 1943. His father was a career Navy officer who eventually rose to the rank of Rear Admiral. Jim grew up moving from base to base across the country, which he later described as leaving him without a sense of home. He went to UCLA in the early 1960s to study film. It was there, on the beach at Venice in the summer of 1965, that he ran into a keyboard player named Ray Manzarek, whom he had known casually at UCLA. Morrison told Manzarek he had been writing songs. Manzarek asked to hear one. Morrison sang the lyrics to what would become Moonlight Drive. Manzarek later said that at that moment he knew they were going to be a band. The Doors formed in the summer of 1965 with Morrison on vocals, Manzarek on keyboards, Robbie Krieger on guitar, and John Densmore on drums. They played house parties. They got a residency at a small club called London Fog on the Sunset Strip. In 1966, they moved to a much better club called the Whiskey A Go-Go, where they were the house band for the summer. Elektra Records signed them in August 1966. Their first album came out in January 1967 and produced their first #1 hit, Light My Fire. Over the next 4 years, the Doors recorded 6 studio albums. Morrison wrote or co-wrote most of the lyrics. He drank enormously. He experimented with drugs of every category. He also read widely, in a way that most rock stars of the 1960s did not, and he considered himself as much a poet as a singer. He published 2 books of poetry during his lifetime, both of them received respectfully by the poetry establishment. By 1970, the Doors had become one of the biggest rock bands in the world, and Jim Morrison was increasingly unable to function as a working performer. He gained weight. He grew a beard. He drank a bottle of whiskey a day, sometimes 2. He was arrested in Miami in March 1969 for indecent exposure at a concert, though it was never conclusively established what he had actually done on stage that night. The trial and appeal took nearly 2 years and consumed enormous amounts of his time and money. In March 1971, Jim Morrison and his longtime girlfriend Pamela Corson moved to Paris. He told friends that he needed a break from the band and from America and that he wanted to focus on his writing. They rented an apartment at 17 Rue Beautreillis in the Marais district. He grew his beard even longer. He walked around the city drinking. He wrote poetry. On the morning of the 3rd of July, 1971, Pamela Corson found Jim Morrison dead in the bathtub of their Paris apartment. He was 27 years old. She called a doctor. The doctor pronounced him dead of heart failure. No autopsy was performed. Under French law at that time, an autopsy was not required if a physician was willing to certify the cause of death. The Paris fire department carried his body out of the apartment building on a stretcher. He was buried 3 days later at Père Lachaise in a plot that Pamela Courson had somehow arranged through her connections in the American expatriate community. The absence of an autopsy has generated more than 50 years of speculation. The most common theory is that Morrison did not die of heart failure at all. The most persistent version of that theory holds that he died of a heroin overdose in the bathroom of a Paris nightclub called the Rock and Roll Circus, that Pamela Courson and other people at the club transported his body back to the apartment, and that the story about the bathtub was invented to avoid scandal. This version has been claimed by multiple people over the years, including the manager of the club and, allegedly, Courson herself in the years before her own death of a heroin overdose in 1974, at age 27. None of it has ever been proven. There is a much smaller subculture of Morrison fans, similar to the Elvis Alivers, who believe that Jim Morrison faked his death in Paris to escape his fame and legal troubles and is still alive somewhere. This is the least credible theory but the most persistent one, because Morrison himself had reportedly told friends in the months before his death that he was thinking about disappearing. His grave at Père Lachaise became a pilgrimage site almost immediately. Through the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, fans covered the grave and the surrounding tombs with graffiti. They spray-painted lyrics from Doors songs on nearby monuments. They left bottles of whiskey and Marlboro cigarettes and joints. They held small unofficial concerts. The cemetery installed a barrier around the grave in the 2000s and stationed a guard nearby during heavy tourist seasons. The graffiti has largely been cleaned off the surrounding tombs, though a few of the marks are so old they are essentially permanent. The grave itself has a modest marker. His father, when he learned of his son's death, had refused to attend the funeral, but he later paid for a bronze plaque to be installed on the stone. The plaque reads in Greek, Kata ton daimona toi, which is usually translated as true to his own spirit. Some fans read it as a reference to a demon. Some read it as a reference to the daimon in the Socratic sense, the inner voice that guides the philosopher. The plaque does not explain itself. Pamela Courson is not buried at Père Lachaise. She died of a heroin overdose in Los Angeles in April 1974 at 27 years old, exactly the same age Jim Morrison had been when he died. Her ashes were interred at Fairhaven Memorial Park in Santa Ana, California, in her parents' family plot. In her will, she had left everything she had to Morrison's parents. This turned out to be significant because his parents had never signed him out of his contract with the Doors. When Courson died and her estate passed to the Morrisons, they inherited half of the Doors' songwriting royalties in perpetuity. Jim Morrison's grave is one of the most visited spots in Père Lachaise. On any given day, there is a small crowd standing around it, talking quietly, or simply looking. On the anniversary of his death, every July, 300s of fans gather. Some of them are older, gray-haired people who remember buying the first Doors album in 1967. Some of them are teenagers who have discovered him recently. The cemetery lets them in. We travel now to a small Swiss village on the shore of Lake Geneva. Tolocannaz is in the canton of Vaud, in the French-speaking part of Switzerland. It is a farming community, and its cemetery is tiny, not much more than 100 graves. Most of them belong to Swiss farming families who have been in the region for generations. Under a modest wooden cross in the middle of that cemetery, in a plot no larger than the ones around it, lies Audrey Hepburn. Now, Audrey Hepburn was not primarily a singer, but she is included in this tour because she sang one of the most famous songs in American film history, Moon River, in Breakfast at Tiffany's in 1961, and because her grave is one of the quietest and most unexpectedly moving spots in 20th century celebrity burial. She was born Audrey Kathleen Rustin in Ixelles, Belgium, in May 1929. Her father was an English banker with fascist sympathies, who abandoned the family when Audrey was 6. Her mother was a Dutch baroness. The family moved to the Netherlands in 1939 as war approached, thinking neutral Holland would be safe. It was not. The German invasion in May 1940 trapped Audrey and her mother in occupied territory for the next 5 years. She was 11 years old when the occupation began, and 16 when it ended. She lived, during those years, on a diet that at times consisted of little more than tulip bulbs and water. She saw her uncle executed by the Germans for his role in the resistance. She acted as a courier for the Dutch resistance herself, carrying messages between hiding places during the last year of the war because a young girl on a bicycle attracted less suspicion than an adult. The hunger winter of 1944 to 1945 nearly killed her. She was severely malnourished. The health effects of that winter never fully left her body. She began studying ballet after the war ended. She moved to London in 1948, where a small role in a musical revue led to a contract with Associated British Picture Corporation. She was cast in Roman Holiday in 1953, opposite Gregory Peck, and won the Academy Award for Best Actress on her first American film. She was 24 years old. Over the next 15 years, she made Sabrina, The Nun's Story, Breakfast at Tiffany's, Charade, My Fair Lady, Two for the Road, and Wait Until Dark. She was nominated for the Academy Award 5 times. She was, for a period, the most photographed woman in the world. She sang on screen. Her rendition of Moon River in Breakfast at Tiffany's, sitting on the fire escape with a guitar, is one of the most beloved musical moments in American film. It won the Oscar for Best Original Song for its composer Henry Mancini and lyricist Johnny Mercer. But she did not sing her own songs in most of her musicals. Marni Nixon dubbed her singing voice in My Fair Lady, which was one of the great disappointments of Hepburn's career. She largely retired from acting in 1967 after divorcing her first husband, Mel Ferrer, and marrying an Italian psychiatrist named Andrea Dotti. The Dottis moved to Rome. She had a second son with him. That marriage also ended in 1982, and she moved to Tollekenaz with a Dutch actor named Robert Wolders, with whom she spent the last 13 years of her life. They never married. She and Wolders bought a house in Tollekenaz called Legacies, which means the peaceful. She gardened there. She read. She and Wolders lived a private life that few people from her Hollywood years ever visited. Beginning in 1988, in the last 5 years of her life, Audrey Hepburn worked as a Goodwill ambassador for UNICEF. She traveled to Ethiopia during the famine of 1988. She traveled to Turkey. She traveled to Central and South America. She traveled to Sudan, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and Somalia in 1992, just months before her death. Her friends said that this work, more than anything else in her adult life, gave her a sense of purpose that had been missing since she left acting. She was diagnosed with a rare form of appendix cancer in October 1992 on her return from Somalia. She underwent surgery in Los Angeles in November. The cancer had spread too widely to be operable. She returned to Legacies for the last months of her life. Audrey Hepburn died at Legacies on the 20th of January 1993, at 63 years old. Her funeral was held at the small local church in Tollekenaz 5 days later. Her sons carried her coffin. She was buried in the village cemetery under a simple wooden cross, in a plot her family had selected because it looked out over the fields she had loved. Her grave is small and easy to miss. The cross is made of dark wood. Her name, Audrey Hepburn, is written on it in white letters. There is a small marker at the base with her birth and death dates. That is all. Fans do come. They usually come in small numbers, quietly, 1 or 2 at a time. The village of Tollekenaz asks that visitors respect the privacy of the surrounding graves and the local community. There is no gift shop. There is no bus tour. If you want to visit Audrey Hepburn's grave, you take the train from Lausanne, walk half a mile from the station through a residential neighborhood, and enter the cemetery through a small metal gate. Almost no one knew, when she was alive, that a Dutch resistance courier who had survived the hunger winter was quietly living out her final years in a farmhouse on Lake Geneva. She had chosen this village because it was the opposite of everything her fame had been. She wanted to be forgotten by the industry that had made her, and remembered only by the people she loved and by the children she had helped. She has, more or less, gotten her wish. We travel now to New Orleans, to a cemetery that most locals have quietly told tourists to avoid for decades. Holt Cemetery is a working cemetery in the mid-city section of the city, off City Park Avenue, in a neighborhood that has struggled for a long time. Most of the graves at Holt are unmarked or marked only with hand-lettered wooden signs or plywood boards. It is what is known as a potter's field, a burial ground for the poor. New Orleans buries most of its dead above ground because of the high water table, but Holt is one of the few cemeteries in the city where graves are dug into the earth. It is also, historically, one of the primary cemeteries for the city's poor black community. Somewhere in Holt Cemetery, in a grave that has never been definitively located, lies Buddy Bolden. Buddy Bolden was, by the account of nearly every musician who saw him play, the first great cornet player in the history of jazz. He was born Charles Joseph Bolden in New Orleans on the 6th of September, 1877. He grew up in the Uptown neighborhood, near what is now Louisiana Avenue. He learned the cornet as a teenager. By 1900, at age 23, he was leading his own band, and he was famous in New Orleans. His band played parties, dances, funerals, and outdoor concerts in the parks. He was reportedly so loud on the cornet that people said you could hear him from miles away when he played in the outdoor pavilions. Jelly Roll Morton, who was born in 1890 and grew up hearing Bolden play, later said that Bolden was the first man he had ever heard play jazz. The word jazz did not yet exist. What Bolden was doing was called ragtime, or blues, or dance music. But the specific things he was doing on the cornet, the improvisation, the bending of blue notes, the rhythmic looseness, would become the foundation of jazz. He never recorded. There is one photograph of him that is universally considered authentic, taken around 1905, showing him standing with his band. There may be a wax cylinder recording of him that was made in the early 1900s and has been lost. No one has ever confirmed that the cylinder existed, and it has never been found. Buddy Bolden's mental health began to collapse in 1906. He was arrested for hitting his mother-in-law with a water pitcher. He had increasingly severe episodes of paranoia and delusion. He heard voices. He believed people were trying to poison him. He was committed in April 1907, at age 30, to the East Louisiana State Hospital in Jackson, Louisiana, about 90 miles north of New Orleans. It was the state's mental institution for black patients. He remained at that hospital for the next 24 years. He never played the cornet again. He rarely spoke. His family visited him occasionally in the early years, but the visits stopped. He was, essentially, forgotten. Buddy Bolden died at the East Louisiana State Hospital on the 4th of November 1931, at age 54, of cerebral arteriosclerosis. His body was shipped back to New Orleans by train. The family could not afford a proper burial. He was buried at Holt Cemetery in a pauper's grave. No one recorded exactly where. For decades, jazz historians tried to find Bolden's grave. Holt Cemetery kept records, but the records were disorganized and incomplete, and many of the wooden markers that once existed had rotted away. In 1996, after a long research effort by the jazz historian Donald Marquis, a plot was identified as the most likely location of Bolden's remains. A monument was placed there. It reads, Charles Joseph Buddy Bolden, first man of jazz. Below the words is a small carved image of a cornet. Whether Buddy Bolden's remains are actually under that monument, no one can say with certainty. The records suggest they might be. But the grounds of Holt Cemetery have been reused many times over the past century, and there are, almost certainly, older bones under and around the memorial that do not belong to him. It is the closest we can get. The founder of jazz, one of the most influential musicians of the 20th century, lies somewhere in a potter's field in New Orleans, in a grave that might or might not be his. Almost no one visits. New Orleans jazz historians make the pilgrimage occasionally. Tourists rarely make it to Holt Cemetery because the neighborhood has a reputation, deserved or not, that keeps most visitors away. The music he made, in the years between 1900 and 1906, is entirely lost. There are no recordings. There is only one photograph. There are only the descriptions of the people who heard him play. And there is a memorial over a grave that may or may not contain his body in a poor cemetery in the city he changed forever. Our next stop takes us to Woodmere Cemetery in Detroit. It is on West 4th Street, on the west side of the city, a large old cemetery founded in 1867. Detroit has had a difficult century, and Woodmere has struggled with it. Sections of the cemetery are neglected, others are well maintained, And in one of the well-kept sections, under a modest marker, lies Levi Stubbs. Levi Stubbs was the lead singer of the Four Tops. His voice was one of the most immediately recognizable in the history of American popular music. He grew up in Detroit, at a time when the city was producing more musical talent per square block than perhaps any place in America. He was born Levi Stubbs on the 6th of June, 1930. His family was from Alabama originally. He was distantly related to the singer Jackie Wilson. He met the other three members of what would become the Four Tops in 1953 at a birthday party: Ronaldo Obie Benson, Lawrence Payton, and Abdul Duke Fakir. The four of them sang together for fun that night, discovered that their voices blended in a way none of them had ever heard before, and decided to form a group. They called themselves the Four Ames. They changed the name to the Four Tops in 1956 to avoid confusion with the Ames brothers. The Four Tops performed for a decade before they had a major hit. They played nightclubs. They sang backing vocals on other people's records. They almost broke up several times. In 1963, they signed with Berry Gordy's Motown Records. Motown paired them with the writing team of Holland Dozier Holland, and the results changed American popular music. Baby, I Need Your Loving, Reach Out, I'll Be There, I Can't Help Myself, Sugar Pie Honey Bunch, Bernadette, Standing in the Shadows of Love, It's the Same Old Song, Between 1964 and 1968. The Four Tops had a run of hits that essentially defined the Motown sound. And at the center of every one of them was Levi Stubbs' voice. Stubbs was, by every account, an unusually humble frontman. The Four Tops were technically a group without a designated lead singer, and Stubbs insisted that the four of them be paid equally throughout the group's history. He also refused to leave the group for a solo career, even when Motown offered him significant money to do so in the 1970s. He said his loyalty was to the other three men. All four of them stayed together for more than 4 decades. Payton died in 1997. Benson died in 2005. Fakir was still alive at the time of Stubbs' death. Stubbs suffered a series of strokes beginning in 2000. He was unable to sing after that. He continued to appear at Four Tops performances in a wheelchair, waving to audiences, while replacement singers took the leads he had made famous. He gave few interviews in his final years. He lived quietly in Detroit with his wife Cline, whom he had married in 1960. Levi Stubbs died at his home in Detroit on the 17th of October, 2008, at 72. His widow said he died peacefully with his family around him. He was buried at Woodmere Cemetery in a family plot. His grave is in a section that is well maintained but not particularly celebrated. The marker is a flat stone. It gives his name and his dates. It does not mention the Four Tops. There is a small musical note carved into the corner. Motown history tours in Detroit generally include a stop at the Motown Museum on West Grand Boulevard at the original Hitsville, USA studio. They do not always include the cemetery visits. Levi Stubbs, whose voice defined the sound of American radio for 4 years in the mid-1960s, lies in a quiet corner of a struggling cemetery in the city that made him, and almost no one visits. Cline Stubbs joined him at Woodmere in 2019. We travel now to a very grand cemetery in the Bronx, New York. Woodlawn Cemetery is one of the great garden cemeteries of the United States, founded in 1863, and it holds some of the most spectacular mausoleums in the country. Woolworth is here. Jay Gould is here. Fiorello LaGuardia is here. And in a beautifully constructed private mausoleum, in a section of the cemetery that gets significant visitor traffic, lies Miles Davis. Miles Dewey Davis III was born in Alton, Illinois, on the 26th of May, 1926. His father was a dentist. His family was solidly middle-class black, and Miles was raised with a sense that he was expected to become someone significant. He got his first trumpet at 13. He went to Juilliard in 1944, at 18, but dropped out after a few months to play in Charlie Parker's band on 52nd Street in Manhattan. Over the next 45 years, Miles Davis changed the course of American music at least 5 separate times. He was central to the birth of bebop with Parker in the mid-1940s. He was the leader of the Birth of the Cool sessions in 1949 and 1950, which invented a quieter, more European strain of jazz. He led the great quintets of the 1950s that produced Round About Midnight, Milestones, and Kind of Blue, the last of which is the best-selling jazz album ever recorded. He led the second great quintet of the mid-1960s with Wayne Shorter, Herbie Hancock, Ron Carter, and Tony Williams, which produced ESP, Miles Smiles, and Nefertiti. And in 1969 and 1970 he essentially invented jazz rock fusion within A Silent Way and Bitches Brew. He was also, throughout most of his life, an addict. He was addicted to heroin from the late 1940s until 1954, when he cleaned himself up at his father's farm in Illinois through pure willpower. He returned to drugs, alcohol, and cocaine in the 1970s. He essentially disappeared from public life between 1975 and 1980. He came back in 1981 and made another 6 or 7 albums before his death. Miles Davis suffered a stroke on the 28th of August, 1991, at his home in Santa Monica, California. He was rushed to St. John's Hospital. He never fully regained consciousness. He died on the 28th of September, 1991, at 65 years old, of the combined effects of a stroke, pneumonia, and respiratory failure. His body was flown from Los Angeles to New York for burial. The private funeral service was held at Woodlawn Cemetery. He is buried in a mausoleum that his family had built for him. The mausoleum is a substantial stone structure in a section of Woodlawn that is often visited by jazz enthusiasts. His name is engraved on the front. Inside, according to his son's account, his trumpet was buried with him. His grave draws steady traffic. Jazz fans from around the world come to Woodlawn to pay respects. Duke Ellington is buried at Woodlawn too, in a different section, and so is Coleman Hawkins and Lionel Hampton and W.C. Handy. The cemetery has become a kind of jazz pantheon. Miles Davis's mausoleum is one of the more visited spots. It is well tended. His name is not going to be forgotten. We travel now down the coast to Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and to Piedmont Memorial Gardens on Silas Creek Parkway. This is a modest cemetery in a modest city, and in a plot in Section H rests Roberta Flack. Roberta Flack was born in Black Mountain, North Carolina, on the 10th of February, 1937, though the family moved to Arlington, Virginia, when she was still very young, and she grew up there. Her father was a jazz pianist who taught piano privately. Roberta was a prodigy. She could play by ear by the age of 4. She won a full music scholarship to Howard University at 15, one of the youngest students the university had ever admitted. She graduated at 19 with a degree in music education. She taught junior high school music in North Carolina and Washington, D.C. for the next several years. She played piano at nightclubs in Washington in the evenings to declement her income. She was a working teacher, not a full-time musician, until 1968, when the jazz pianist Les McCann heard her singing in a club called Mr. Henry's on Capitol Hill. McCann arranged for an audition with Atlantic Records. She was signed by Atlantic in early 1969. Her first album, First Take, was released in 1969 and sold modestly. It contained a song called The First Time Ever I Saw Your Face, an English folk song written by Ewan MacColl in 1957. Nothing much happened with the album for 2 years. Then, in 1971, Clint Eastwood used The First Time Ever I Saw Your Face in a pivotal romantic scene in his film Play Misty for Me. Within weeks, the song was being played on every radio station in America. It spent 6 weeks at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in the summer of 1972. It won the Grammy Award for Record of the Year. Roberta Flack won again the next year, in 1974, for Killing Me Softly with his song. She became the first artist ever to win the Record of the Year Grammy in 2 consecutive years. She recorded a series of duets with Donny Hathaway, her friend from Howard, that produced some of the most beloved soul recordings of the 1970s. Where is the Love? The Closer I Get to You. These duets are still, half a century later, played at weddings and funerals across America. Hathaway took his own life in January 1979 by jumping from the 15th floor of the Essex House in New York City. He was 33 years old and had been suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. Flack was devastated. She has said in interviews that she never fully recovered from his death. that she felt she should have seen the signs, that she thought of him every day for the rest of her life. She continued to record and perform for decades. She dealt with the death of her longtime musical partner and adapted. She released more than a dozen albums after Hathaway's death. She never remarried, though she had been briefly married in her 20s to the jazz bassist Steve Novosel and had no children. In 2018, Roberta Flack suffered a stroke on stage at the Apollo Theater in Harlem during a Jazz Foundation of America benefit concert. She recovered partially, but was unable to return to full performing. In 2022, her family announced that she had been diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS, and was no longer able to sing or speak. She was 85 years old. Roberta Flack died on the 24th of February 2025 at her home in New York City. She was 88. The cause of death was cardiac arrest. She had been in hospice care for weeks. Her body was flown back to North Carolina for burial. She was interred at Piedmont Memorial Gardens in Winston-Salem, near where members of her extended family are buried. Her grave is marked by a plain, flat stone with her name and her dates. There is a small carving of a piano keyboard beside the dates. Almost no one has visited yet, because the burial is still relatively recent as of this recording. But the pattern in these matters is fairly predictable. Within a decade, the fans will forget where she is buried. The city of Winston-Salem, which is not a music tourism destination, will not particularly promote her grave. And the woman whose voice defined the soft soul of the early 1970s will lie in near total quiet in a modest cemetery in a mid-sized southern city. Donny Hathaway is buried at Lake Charles Cemetery in St. Louis, Missouri, not far from where he was born. He and Roberta Flack, whose voices together defined an era, lie now more than 700 miles apart. They will never share a grave, but their duets will play on some radio station, somewhere in America, tonight. Let us travel now to Aberdeen, Washington, a small logging town on the Pacific coast about 100 miles southwest of Seattle. Aberdeen has never recovered from the collapse of the logging industry. Its downtown is full of empty storefronts. Its population has been declining for 50 years. The local high school is called J.M. Weatherwax High, and under a bridge on the Wishkah River that runs through the middle of town, there is a small plaque bolted to the concrete abutment. The plaque bears the name Kurt Cobain. Kurt Cobain is not buried under the bridge. He is not buried anywhere. His remains were cremated after his death, and the ashes were divided. Some were scattered in the Wishkah River in Aberdeen. Some were scattered at a Buddhist monastery in Ithaca, New York. Some were kept by his widow, Courtney Love, and were displayed at various points in a small statue she had made in his shape. In 2008, some of the ashes were reportedly stolen from Courtney Love's home. Whether they were recovered is unclear. There is no single grave for Kurt Cobain. The Aberdeen plaque under the Yonge Street Bridge is the closest thing that exists. He was born in Aberdeen on the 20th of February 1967 at Grays Harbor Community Hospital. His father Donald was a mechanic. His mother Wendy was a homemaker. His parents divorced when Kurt was 9, and the divorce was traumatic. Cobain later said, in dozens of interviews, that he never fully recovered from it. He bounced between his mother's house and his father's house for years. He was a quiet, artistic child who was intensely interested in music from a very young age. He got his first guitar for his 14th birthday. He fell in love with punk rock at 15 through his uncle's record collection. He formed his first band, Fecal Matter, in 1985, with a friend from Weatherwax High. He met the bassist Krist Novoselic in 1986. Together they formed Nirvana in 1987. Nirvana played the underground club circuit of the Pacific Northwest for 2 years. They released their first album, Bleach, in 1989, on Sub Pop, the small Seattle label that had signed them. Bleach cost $606 to record. It sold modestly. The band signed with DGC Records, a major label, in 1990. Their second album, Nevermind, was released on the 24th of September 1991. Smells Like Teen Spirit was the first single. It reached number 1 on the Billboard Rock chart, then crossed to the Hot 100. Nevermind reached number 1 on the Billboard 200 in January 1992, displacing Michael Jackson's Dangerous. Nirvana became, essentially overnight, the biggest rock band in the world. Grunge became the most covered subject in music journalism. The city of Seattle became briefly the most photographed city in America. And Kurt Cobain, who had spent his teenage years in Aberdeen genuinely believing that punk rock was an underground music that would never reach a mass audience, found himself at the front of a cultural movement he had never particularly wanted to lead. Cobain was already addicted to heroin by the time Nevermind was released. He had been dealing with severe, undiagnosed stomach pain for years, and heroin had, briefly, made the pain manageable. He had also married the singer Courtney Love in February 1992. Their daughter, Frances Bean Cobain, was born in August of that year. The next 20 months of Cobain's life were spent in a public deterioration that reads, in retrospect, like a slow-motion car accident. He was in and out of rehab. He overdosed multiple times. His marriage was volatile. His relationship with his bandmates was strained. Nirvana recorded a third album, In Utero, in early 1993, and toured to support it in the fall of that year. Cobain gave a legendary performance for MTV Unplugged in November 1993 in New York, sitting on a stool surrounded by black candles and stargazer lilies. Some fans have said that they knew, watching that broadcast, that they were watching a funeral. On the 4th of March, 1994, on tour in Rome, Kurt Cobain overdosed on champagne and Rohypnol. He was in a coma for 20 hours. Doctors initially reported it as accidental, but it later became clear that Cobain had left a suicide note that was found beside him. He survived. The tour was canceled. He returned to Seattle. Courtney Love checked him into rehab in Los Angeles on the 30th of March, 1994. He walked out of the facility on April 1. He flew back to Seattle. He was seen at his home at 171 Lake Washington Boulevard East on April 3. He purchased a shotgun on April 4. Sometime between April 5 and the 8th of April, 1994, in a small room above the garage of his Lake Washington home, Kurt Cobain took his own life. His body was found on April 8 by an electrician who had come to install security lighting. He was 27 years old. A suicide note was found. It was addressed to an imaginary childhood friend of Cobain's named Bada, and quoted lines from Neil Young's song Hey Hey, My, Into the Black. It's better to burn out than to fade away. His body was cremated. There was no funeral for the public. There was a small private ceremony at a church in Seattle, attended by his family and a few close friends. Courtney Love read parts of the suicide note aloud at the ceremony, breaking down repeatedly. The house at 171 Lake Washington Boulevard was sold shortly after Cobain's death. The garage was demolished. Fans came to the property for years, sitting on the small park bench next to the house that overlooks Lake Washington. They left flowers, guitar picks, and handwritten notes. The bench became a shrine. It is still there. It is called Cobain Bench by locals, but there is no grave. The ashes went into the Wishkah River, into a Buddhist monastery, into a statue, into perhaps a burglar's hands. And the plaque under the Yonge Street Bridge in Aberdeen is the closest thing that exists to a place where you can stand and say you are with him. The plaque was placed by the city of Aberdeen in 2011, over the objections of some local residents who felt uncomfortable memorializing a musician they associated with drugs and difficulty. The bench where Cobain reportedly spent time as a homeless teenager, sleeping under the bridge, is a few yards from the plaque. Fans from all over the world come to Aberdeen to see it. Some of them cry. The city has never quite figured out how to feel about Kurt Cobain. He was Aberdeen's most famous son, and he was also the person whose songs made the world feel that Aberdeen was a bleak place unfit for human habitation. Both things are true. And under the bridge, on the muddy bank of the Wishkah, the plaque sits and waits for whoever comes next. We travel now to a modest cemetery in the small town of Camden, Tennessee, about an hour and a half west of Nashville. Shiloh Cemetery is small and rural. It is not on any music tourism route. It is not marked from any highway. And in a plot near the road, under a marker in the shape of a broken column, lies a young pilot named Roger Peterson. Roger Peterson was 21 years old on the night of the 3rd of February 1959. He was a commercial pilot for a small charter operation called Dwyer Flying Service in Mason City, Iowa. He was not yet fully certified for instrument flying. He was, essentially, still learning his trade. And on the evening of the 2nd of February, 1959, he was hired to fly 3 musicians and their manager from Mason City to Fargo, North Dakota, a stop on the Winter Dance Party tour. The 3 musicians were Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and J.P., the Big Bopper Richardson. Buddy Holly was 22 years old that night. He had married the year before. His wife Maria Elena was 6 months pregnant. He was already, at 22, one of the most influential songwriters in the history of rock and roll. Peggy Sue, Every Day, That'll Be the Day, Oh Boy, Rave On. He had built a career in less than 2 years that would inspire the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, and essentially every rock musician who followed him. He was tired. The tour was brutal. It was February in the Midwest. The tour bus had no heat. Holly had chartered the flight because he wanted to sleep in a hotel and do laundry before the next show. Ritchie Valens was 17. He was a Mexican-American kid from Pacoima, California, who had recorded La Bamba, Come On Let's Go, and Donna in an 8-month career. Donna had reached number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100. He was one of the first Latino rock stars. J.P. Richardson, the Big Bopper, was 28. He was a Beaumont, Texas disc jockey who had recorded Chantilly Lace in 1958 and had become an overnight sensation. He was 7 months pregnant with his second child. His wife had told him she thought this tour would be his last one. They flew out of Mason City just before 1 a.m. on the 3rd of February 1959. Weather conditions were marginal. Light snow was falling. Visibility was reduced. The forecast was for the weather to worsen through the night. Roger Peterson had been given a weather briefing by his employer that seriously understated the danger. He had not been given the most recent updates from the Federal Aviation Agency, which by that point were forecasting instrument flying conditions along the flight path. The Beechcraft Bonanza took off at 12:55 a.m. The airport tower watched it climb to about 800 feet, then bank to the left. Then it disappeared from view. When Peterson did not check in as scheduled, the tower attempted to reach him by radio. There was no response. At 9:35 a.m. the next morning, a farmer named Albert Jewell found the wreckage in his cornfield about 6 miles northwest of Mason City. The plane had crashed at high speed. Everyone on board had died instantly. Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and J.P. Richardson had been thrown from the aircraft. Their bodies were in the snow. Roger Peterson was still inside what remained of the plane. The bodies were removed from the field over the course of the day. Buddy Holly's body was returned to Lubbock, Texas, his hometown. His funeral was held at the Tabernacle Baptist Church on February 7th. He was buried at the Lubbock City Cemetery. His grave, in a plot marked simply Buddy Holly, using the original family spelling of his last name, is now one of the most visited music graves in Texas. There is a memorial statue for him in downtown Lubbock. The Buddy Holly Center on Crickets Avenue is a museum dedicated to his memory. Ritchie Valens was returned to San Fernando Mission Cemetery in Mission Hills, California. He is buried near his mother, who died a few years after him. His grave is a modest marker. The cemetery has become a pilgrimage site for Chicano rock fans. J.P. Richardson was returned to Beaumont, Texas. He was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Beaumont. In 2007, his body was exhumed at the request of his son Jay Richardson, who wanted to conduct DNA testing to disprove a persistent rumor that his father had survived the crash. The autopsy confirmed conclusively that Richardson had died in the crash and that his body was the correct one. He was reburied. His son Jay, who had become a country singer performing under the name The Big Bopper Jr., died in 2013. And Roger Peterson, the 1-year-old pilot, was returned to Alta, Iowa, his hometown, and buried at Buena Vista Memorial Cemetery. There is a small memorial plaque there. Almost nobody visits. I include Roger Peterson in this tour because Don McLean called it The Day the Music Died in American Pie in 1971. Everyone who has ever hummed that song and understood the reference has been mourning 3 musicians. But 4 people died that night in the cornfield near Mason City, and the 4th one was a young pilot who had made a bad decision under pressure in whether he was not fully qualified to fly in because a charter customer had asked him for a favor. He is not visited. His name is not on any tour. There is no memorial concert for Roger Peterson. There is a small plaque at Buena Vista Memorial Cemetery in Alta, Iowa, that gives his name and his dates. That is all. We travel now to Los Angeles, to a cemetery that is one of the great cemeteries of the American entertainment industry. Inglewood Park Cemetery sits at 720 East Florence Avenue in Inglewood, and it has been the burial ground for many of the great figures of African American music since the middle of the 20th century. Ella Fitzgerald is buried here. Ray Charles is buried here. Ike Turner is buried here. Etta James is buried here. And in a family plot in Section D, in a plain grave marked with a simple flat stone, lies Sam Cooke. Sam Cooke was born Samuel Cooke on the 22nd of January, 1931, in Clarksdale, Mississippi. His family moved to Chicago when he was 2 years old. His father was a minister at a small Baptist church on the south side of Chicago. Sam started singing in gospel groups as a small child. By 15, he was singing lead for a gospel group called the Highway QCZ. By 19, he had been recruited to join the Soul Stirrers, one of the most famous gospel groups in America. He sang with the Soul Stirrers from 1950 to 1957. He was a genuinely great gospel singer, and he became one of the most beloved figures in black gospel music during those years. Then, in 1957, at age 26, he made the enormously controversial decision to leave gospel and try secular music. Many people in the gospel community treated this as a betrayal. He was called an apostate. He was denounced from pulpits. His first pop hit was "You Send Me," released in November 1957. It went to number 1 on both the Billboard Pop chart and the R&B chart. He wrote it himself. Over the next 7 years, he had more than 30 hits. Cupid, Chain Gang, Wonderful World, Twistin' the Night Away, Bring It On Home to Me, Another Saturday Night. And in December 1963, he wrote A Change Is Gonna Come, inspired partly by Bob Dylan's Blowin' in the Wind and partly by an incident where Cooke and his band had been refused rooms at a whites-only motel in Shreveport, Louisiana. He released it as a single in December 1964, which was less than 3 weeks after his death. Sam Cooke's death is one of the most disputed and troubling in the history of American music. On the night of the 10th of December 1964, he was in Los Angeles with his manager Al Schmidt. He met a young woman named Elisa Boyer at a nightclub called Martoni's. According to Boyer, Cooke offered to drive her home. According to Boyer, he instead drove her to the Hacienda Motel on South Figueroa Street and forced her into a room against her will. According to Boyer, when Cooke went to the bathroom, she grabbed most of his clothes along with her own and fled the room. Cooke, wearing only a sport coat and one shoe, went to the motel office looking for her. The manager of the motel, Bertha Franklin, was in the office. She said that Cooke broke down the door of her office and attacked her. She said that she pulled a .22 caliber pistol from a drawer and that she shot him in the chest at close range. She said that he then attempted to strike her and that she beat him with a broomstick. Sam Cooke was 33 years old when he died on the floor of the office of the Hacienda Motel on the 11th of December 1964. The Los Angeles Police Department accepted the manager's account and ruled the death justifiable homicide. The case was closed within days. Neither Bertha Franklin nor Elisa Boyer was charged with any crime. For 60 years, there have been questions about this account. Sam Cooke's family has never accepted it. His widow Barbara believed that he had been robbed of a large sum of cash that he had been carrying that night, and that the entire encounter had been a setup. Various investigators over the years have raised questions about the physical evidence, but the case has never been reopened, and it is now essentially impossible to prove anything. Bertha Franklin died in 1979. Elisa Boyer, whose real name was Elisa Boyer, was later convicted of second-degree murder in an unrelated shooting in 1979 and served time. She is believed to have died sometime after that, but the exact circumstances are not public. Sam Cooke was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale after a public funeral. In 1965, his family had his remains moved to Inglewood Park Cemetery in a private ceremony. The reasons for the move have never been fully explained. The most likely explanation is that his widow Barbara Cook wanted him closer to where the family lived and buried other members of the family. His grave at Inglewood is a modest flat marker. It gives his name and his dates. There is no mention of the songs. There is no mention of the disputed circumstances of his death. There is simply Samuel Cook, and the years, and the silence. His widow Barbara married Bobby Womack a few months after Sam's death, which was one of the most controversial marriages in the history of soul music. That marriage ended within a few years. Barbara Cook Womack died in 2018. She is buried in a different section of Inglewood. Sam Cooke's grave is visited regularly by fans, though not in the numbers that visit Elvis at Graceland. R&B historians make the pilgrimage. Musicians who grew up hearing "a change is gonna come" to pay respects. But the woman he loved, who he married, who benefited from his estate for years, is buried nearby, and their graves are not near each other. It is one of the more complicated marriages in Inglewood Park Cemetery. Our next stop is a small, unmarked cornfield in Meigs County, Ohio, about 70 miles from the West Virginia border. There is no cemetery here. There is nothing except a small metal marker beside a country road, placed by the local historical society. And this is the site where, on the 31st of December 1985, a small plane owned by Ricky Nelson crashed and killed him, along with 6 other people. Ricky Nelson was one of the most famous teenagers in America in the late 1950s. He was born Eric Hilliard Nelson on the 8th of May 1940, in Teaneck, New Jersey, into a family that was already famous. His father, Ozzie Nelson, had been a bandleader and radio star. His mother, Harriet Hilliard, was a singer and actress. When Ricky was 8 years old, in 1949, his parents began a radio series called The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, based loosely on their own family life. Ricky and his older brother David appeared on the radio show. In 1952, the show moved to television. It ran until 1966, making it the longest-running family sitcom in the history of American television. At that point, Ricky Nelson was, therefore, on national television every week from the age of 12 to the age of 26. Millions of Americans watched him grow up. When he started singing on the show at 17, in 1957, his records began to sell immediately. I'm Walkin', A Teenager's Romance, Poor Little Fool, Lonesome Town, Travelin' Man, Hello Mary Lou, Fool's Rush, In, For You, between 1,957 and 1,962. Ricky Nelson had 30 top 40 hits, more than anyone in America except Elvis Presley. He was, briefly, one of the biggest teenage idols in the country. And he was also, from the beginning, quietly resistant to the whole idea of teenage idolatry. He wanted to be taken seriously as a musician. He idolized Carl Perkins. He hired the great guitarist James Burton to play with him, and Burton's playing became a fundamental part of the Nelson sound. He wrote his own songs. He tried to make records that mattered. His career declined through the 1960s as musical tastes changed. He tried to reinvent himself as a country rock artist in the late 1960s and had a modest success with Garden Party in 1972, a song he wrote about being booed off the stage at a rock and roll revival concert at Madison Square Garden. But he never fully recovered his early commercial peak. He toured constantly through the 1970s and 1980s, playing state fairs and casinos, mostly performing his old hits. He also drank, and in the last several years of his life, he was flying on a small chartered plane that he had bought from Jerry Lee Lewis, a 1944 Douglas DC-3 that had been in service for more than 40 years. Aviation experts had raised concerns about the plane's condition. Nelson kept using it because it was cheaper than chartering more modern aircraft. On the afternoon of the 31st of December 1985, the DC-3 was flying from Gunnersville, Alabama, to Dallas, Texas, for a New Year's Eve concert. There were 7 people on board. Ricky Nelson, his fiancée Helen Blair, his band members Bobby Neal, Andy Chapin, Pat Woodward, and Rick Infeld, and the 2 pilots, Ken Ferguson and Brad Rank. Around 5:15 p.m., a fire broke out in the cabin. The exact cause has been debated for 40 years. The National Transportation Safety Board eventually concluded that the fire was probably caused by a malfunctioning cabin heater. Others have suggested that someone was smoking freebase cocaine on board and started the fire that way. The evidence has never been conclusive. What is certain is that a fire broke out in the cabin at cruising altitude and that the pilots were unable to make it to an airport. Pilot Brad Rank made an emergency landing in a field near DeKalb, Texas. The impact was hard but survivable. Both pilots managed to escape through the cockpit windows before being consumed by the fire. Ricky Nelson and everyone else in the cabin died. His body was so badly burned that identification took several days. He was 45 years old. His body was returned to Los Angeles. He is buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Hollywood Hills, in a plot in the Revelation section. His grave is a flat marker with his name and his dates. Nearby are the graves of his mother Harriet, who joined him in 1994, and his father Ozzie, who died in 1975. The Nelson family is together in the Hollywood Hills. The DC-3 crashed in a field just outside DeKalb, Texas, and the local historical society placed a small marker at the site. It is on private ranch land. Very few people ever go to see it. The marker gives the date and lists the names of the 7 people who died. I include this stop because Ricky Nelson was one of the most famous teenagers of the 20th century. Millions of Americans watched him grow up. His songs are still played on oldies stations. His body is buried at Forest Lawn, in one of the largest and most visited cemeteries in Los Angeles. But the specific place where he died is in a cornfield near a rural Texas town of about 1,700 people, and almost nobody makes the trip. The place where his life ended is one of the loneliest music-related sites in America. We travel now to a small country cemetery in Randolph County, Georgia, about 3 hours south of Atlanta and just north of the Florida line. Wesley Chapel Methodist Church Cemetery is not marked on any highway sign. It sits on a rural road called Georgia Route 41. You have to know it is there to find it. And in a family plot, under a modest headstone, lies Otis Redding. Otis Redding was born on the 9th of September, 1941, in Dawson, Georgia, about 20 miles from where he is now buried. His father was a Baptist minister and part-time sharecropper. His mother worked as a laundress. His family moved to Macon when Otis was 3. And he grew up in the Tyndall Heights housing project on the west side of Macon, a segregated public housing complex that had produced other soul singers, including Little Richard. He dropped out of high school at 15 to help support his family. He worked as a musician in local Macon clubs, and eventually joined a band called Johnny Jenkins and the Pine Toppers as a driver and occasional singer. In 1962, Johnny Jenkins had a recording session booked at Stax Studios in Memphis. Redding drove him there. Jenkins finished his session early. Redding, who had been sitting in the corner of the studio, asked producer Jim Stewart if he could try singing a song. Stewart, out of politeness, said yes. Redding sang "These Arms of Mine," a song he had written himself. That recording, made almost by accident with a few minutes of leftover studio time, was released as a single on Volt Records in late 1962. It reached number 20 on the R&B chart. Redding was signed to a full contract almost immediately. Over the next 5 years, he made some of the most influential soul recordings ever put on tape. Pain in My Heart, Mr. Pitiful, I've Been Loving You Too Long, Respect, which he wrote and which Aretha Franklin later covered to greater fame, Try a Little Tenderness, Fa 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 Sad Song. He performed at the Monterey Pop Festival in June 1967, which was his crossover moment. White rock and folk audiences discovered him. He was on the verge of becoming a major mainstream star. In late November 1967, Otis Redding went into Stax Studios in Memphis to record a new song that he had co-written with Steve Cropper. It was called Sittin' On the Dock of the Bay. Redding recorded the vocal in one take. The recording ended with him whistling, because Redding, who had a habit of humming or whistling to himself during rehearsals, had not yet written a final chorus, and Cropper was going to add a lyric. They were planning to fix the ending later. They never did. On the 10th of December, 1967, Otis Redding boarded a small twin-engine Beechcraft H-18 airplane in Cleveland, Ohio, to fly to Madison, Wisconsin, for a show. On board were Redding, his personal assistant, and 4 members of his backing band, the Bar-Kays. The pilot was Redding's own personal pilot, Richard Fraser. The weather in Wisconsin was terrible. Freezing rain. Low ceiling. Visibility measured in feet. The plane crashed into Lake Monona, less than 4 miles from the Madison airport, at approximately 3:25 p.m. The exact cause was never determined. Fraser, an experienced pilot, may have become disoriented in the poor weather. The Beechcraft may have iced up. Whatever the cause, the plane hit the water at high speed. Only one person survived. Ben Cawley of the Barkays managed to escape the sinking plane and hold onto a seat cushion until rescuers arrived. Cawley later said that he had watched Redding's body float past him in the freezing water and had been unable to reach him. Otis Redding was 26 years old. His body was recovered the next day from the bottom of Lake Monona. His body was returned to Georgia by train. The funeral was held on the 18th of December, 1967, at the City Auditorium in Macon. More than 4,000 people came, including James Brown, Sam and Dave, Wilson Pickett, and Solomon Burke. Aretha Franklin sang. Jerry Wexler of Atlantic Records delivered a eulogy that became famous in the music industry, ending with the words, "Otis was a natural prince. He was a lord of the human spirit." Redding was buried at the family farm in Round Oak, Georgia, where his family lived. Later, his widow Zelma had his remains moved to the Wesley Chapel Methodist Church Cemetery, which was closer to their home and easier for the family to visit. His grave is a modest gray granite marker. It gives his name, the dates, and the words, "In loving memory." His widow Zelma survived him by more than 50 years and died in 2020 at 79. She is buried in the same plot. Their 4 children, 3 of whom went on to have modest music careers as the Reddings, have their own lives in Georgia. "Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay" was released as a single on the 8th of January, 1968, about 4 weeks after Redding's death. It reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in March 1968. It was the first posthumous number 1 single in American music history. Redding never got to hear it played on the radio. He never got to write a real chorus. The whistling at the end of the song, which he had intended to replace, is now considered one of the most haunting sounds in soul music. His grave is quiet. Some fans do make the pilgrimage to the small rural cemetery in Randolph County, but the numbers are modest. Most of the tourists who come to Georgia for music history go to Macon, which has a proper Otis Redding memorial in the form of a bronze statue at Gateway Park downtown. The statue was placed there in 2002. Fans get their pictures taken with it. Very few of them drive the additional 90 miles south to see the actual grave. Let us now travel to Aretha Franklin's grave, because we cannot tell the story of Otis Redding without also visiting the woman who took his song Respect and made it into an entirely different anthem. She was born in Memphis on the 25th of March 1942, but she was raised in Detroit from the age of 2, and Detroit is where she is buried. Woodlawn Cemetery in Detroit is on West Warren Avenue, not to be confused with the more famous Woodlawn in the Bronx. This Woodlawn was founded in 1895. It is one of the great cemeteries of Detroit, though like much of the city it has struggled financially over the decades. Henry Ford is not buried here. Rosa Parks is. Levi Stubbs of the Four Tops, whom we visited earlier tonight, is here. And in a mausoleum in the Rose Room section, in a crypt that has become one of the most visited spots in Detroit, lies Aretha Franklin. Aretha Louise Franklin was the daughter of the Reverend C.L. Franklin, the pastor of New Bethel Baptist Church in Detroit. Her father was one of the most famous Black Baptist ministers in America in the 1950s and 1960s. His sermons were recorded and sold on records that reached hundreds of thousands of listeners. Aretha grew up in a house that hosted Mahalia Jackson, Dinah Washington, Sam Cooke, Duke Ellington, Martin Luther King Jr., and dozens of other major figures. Her father spotted her talent very early and had her singing solos in his church by the age of 9. She recorded her first gospel album at 14. Columbia Records signed her when she was 18 and tried to turn her into a supper club jazz singer. It did not work. She made 6 albums for Columbia between 1961 and 1966. Some of them are excellent. None of them were commercially successful. Her career transformed when she signed with Atlantic Records in November 1966. Jerry Wexler, the producer who had spoken at Otis Redding's funeral, took her to Fame Studios in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, where they recorded her first Atlantic single, I Never Loved a Man. The Way I Love You. It was released in February 1967 and went to #1 on the R&B chart. Over the next 2 years, Aretha Franklin produced a run of recordings that has arguably never been equaled in American popular music. Respect. Chain of Fools. Baby I Love You. You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman. Think. The House That Jack Built. Since You've Been Gone. Ain't No Way. She won the Grammy for Best Female R&B Vocal Performance in each of the first 8 years the award existed. She lived a full and complicated life for another 50 years. She sang at Martin Luther King Jr.'s funeral in 1968. She recorded the greatest gospel album of the modern era, Amazing Grace, in 1972. She had her father's blessing when she moved into secular music, but she was always a gospel singer at heart. She never stopped singing in church. She sang at every major American cultural event from the mid-1960s to the mid-2010s. She sang at Barack Obama's inauguration in 2009, wearing a rhinestone-studded hat that became internet famous. She was, in every meaningful sense, the greatest female singer of the 20th century. That is not a controversial claim. She was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2010 and lived with it for 8 years. She kept it very private. She continued to perform when she could. Her final concert was at Cass Technical High School in Detroit, her old school, in November 2017. She died at her home in Detroit on the 16th of August 2018, at 76 years old. She was surrounded by family. Her funeral was one of the largest events in Detroit in a generation. It was held at Greater Grace Temple on the 31st of August 2018, and it lasted 8 hours. Bill Clinton spoke. Stevie Wonder performed. Ariana Grande sang, You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman. Faith Hill sang. Chaka Khan sang. Jennifer Hudson sang. Yolanda Adams sang. The lineup of performers was staggering. The service was broadcast nationally. Aretha Franklin's casket was made of solid gold-plated bronze. Her body was dressed in a series of different outfits over the several days of the memorial services, a tradition in black funerals. She was, in her final public appearance, celebrated in a way that few Americans have ever been celebrated. She was buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in Detroit alongside her father, her sisters Irma and Carolyn, her brother Cecil, and other members of her family. Her mausoleum crypt is prominently placed. Fans visit constantly. It is one of the most visited celebrity graves in the Midwest. Aretha Franklin's grave is not lonely. It is well tended and well visited. But she deserves inclusion in this tour because so many of the singers we are visiting tonight are not receiving even a small fraction of what Aretha is receiving. And because the difference between a lonely music grave and a well-visited one has almost nothing to do with the significance of the artist. It is a matter of geography, family, marketing, and sometimes pure luck. We travel now to a very different resting place. In the coastal town of Sausalito, California, just across the Golden Gate Bridge from San Francisco, at a spot in the water off Fort Cronkite, a woman's ashes were scattered into the Pacific Ocean in July 1970. The woman was Janis Joplin. There is no grave for Janis Joplin. Her ashes were scattered by her family in accordance with her wishes. There is a plaque at her elementary school in Port Arthur, Texas. There is a mural in San Francisco. There is a small memorial in Landmark Motor Hotel in Hollywood, where she died, but there is no grave. Janis Joplin was born on the 19th of January, 1943, in Port Arthur, Texas, a refinery town on the Gulf Coast. Her father was an engineer at Texaco. Her mother was a registrar at a business college. She was, by every account, an unhappy child in a conservative small city that had no idea what to do with a girl who was reading beat poetry at 14 and wanted to be a folk singer. She fled to San Francisco in 1963, at age 19. She sang in coffee houses. She sang in the Haight-Ashbury clubs. She was thin, plain, and had a voice that could shatter a room. She joined Big Brother and the Holding Company in 1966. Their appearance at the Monterey Pop Festival in June 1967, the same festival where Otis Redding had his breakthrough performance, made Big Brother famous overnight. The next year, they released Cheap Thrills, which reached #1 on the Billboard 200. Janis left Big Brother in late 1968 and formed the Cosmic Blues Band. She was drinking heavily. She was using heroin. She was giving interviews in which she said things like, "I would rather have 10 good years than 50 mediocre ones." which she seemed to mean literally. She toured in 1969 with the Cosmic Blues Band and released the album I Got Dem Ol' Cosmic Blues Again Mama in October of that year. It was well received but did not equal Cheap Thrills. She broke up that band and started a new one, the Full Tilt Boogie Band, in early 1970. She was recording her third solo album, which would become Pearl, at Sunset Sound Recorders in Los Angeles. On the night of the 3rd of October 1970, after a recording session that had gone well, Janis Joplin went with her band and some friends to Barney's Beanery in West Hollywood for drinks. She was staying at the Landmark Motor Hotel in Hollywood while working on Pearl. She returned to her room at the Landmark, room 105, around 1A. She had bought a small amount of heroin from her dealer, as she did most nights. She was found dead in her room on the afternoon of the 4th of October 1970 by her road manager, John Cook. She had been dead for approximately 18 hours. The cause was an accidental heroin overdose. The dealer had, unknown to her, sold her a batch that was much purer than what he usually sold. Several other of his customers died from the same batch that same weekend. She was 27 years old. In a very tragic pattern that has always shaped her legacy, Jimi Hendrix had died of an accidental drug overdose in London, less than 3 weeks earlier. On the 18th of September 1970, he was also 27. Both of them were now part of what has come to be called the 27 Club, a grim cohort of musicians who died at that age. Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones had drowned at 27 in July 1969. Jim Morrison, whom we visited earlier tonight in Paris, would die at 27 in July 1971. Kurt Cobain, whose bridge in Aberdeen we visited earlier, would die at 27 in April 1994. Amy Winehouse would die at 27 in July 2011. Janis Joplin's body was cremated at Pierce Brothers Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles. Her mother Dorothy came from Texas to arrange it. In her will, Janis had left specific instructions. She had left $2,500 in her will for a wake to be held for her friends at the Lion's Share in San Anselmo, California, a music venue north of San Francisco. The wake was held on the 26th of October, 1970. Her friends were told to have a good time on her behalf. Her ashes were scattered from a small plane off the California coast, in the waters off Fort Cronkite in the Marin Headlands. Her family did the scattering privately. There are no coordinates. There is no marker. She is in the ocean. Pearl was released posthumously in January 1971. It contained her recording of Me and Bobby McGee, which she had cut in September 1970, and which went to number 1 in March 1971. She never got to hear it on the radio. Fans have wanted a physical place to visit her for more than 50 years. They have made various pilgrimages. The Landmark Motor Hotel, where she died, was demolished in 2003. The site is now a Highland Gardens hotel. Some fans stay in room 105 to be near where she died. It is not officially marked. But the truth is that Janis Joplin has no grave. Her mother, before she died, told friends that scattering the ashes had been Janis's idea. Janis had never wanted anywhere she could be tied down. Even in death, she wanted to keep moving. And so she does. The tides move her ashes around the Pacific coast, up and down the California shore. She is, in a very literal sense, everywhere and nowhere. We travel now to a much colder, more secluded place. We are going to Iceland, to Fossvogur Cemetery in Reykjavik, a large cemetery on the west side of the city that has been the primary burial ground of Iceland's capital since 1932. And in a modest plot near the center of the cemetery lies Björk's father, Guðmundur Gunnarsson, which is not quite the point of this stop. Let me redirect. Björk is not the singer we are visiting in Iceland tonight. She is alive. And she is not the singer we are visiting. The singer we are visiting in Iceland is her one-time collaborator, Anthony Hegarty. Actually, no. Anthony Hegarty is now a noni, a still-living transgender singer who worked with Björk on the album Volta. Let me pivot to a different Icelandic music grave. Iceland is a small country with a very rich musical tradition, but the specific singer I want to visit tonight is not, in fact, in Iceland. Let me instead go to Copenhagen, Denmark. We travel now to Denmark, to Assistens Cemetery in Copenhagen. This is one of the great cemeteries of Northern Europe. Hans Christian Andersen is buried here. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard is buried here. Niels Bohr, the physicist, is buried here. And in a plot in Section D lies the Danish jazz musician Ben Webster. He was not a singer per se, but he was one of the greatest tenor saxophonists in the history of jazz. And I include him here because his life ended in a way that fits our theme almost perfectly. Ben Webster was born Benjamin Francis Webster in Kansas City, Missouri, on the 27th of March 1909. He was a founding figure of the Kansas City jazz scene of the 1930s. He played with Duke Ellington's orchestra from 1940 to 1943, during Ellington's greatest period, and his solos on tracks like Cottontail and All Too Soon are among the most beloved in jazz history. He continued to work through the 1950s in various combos in New York, but in 1964, Webster made an unusual decision. He moved to Europe. He toured Denmark. He liked Denmark. He settled in Copenhagen. He lived in Copenhagen for the last 9 years of his life. He played at small clubs. He recorded a series of albums for the Danish label Steeplechase. He drank heavily but was, by every account, gentle and beloved by the Copenhagen jazz community. He never went home to America. His American friends came to visit him occasionally, but he seemed to feel more at ease in Copenhagen than he ever had in the United States. Ben Webster died in Amsterdam on the 20th of September, 1973, of a cerebral hemorrhage, while on a brief performing trip. He was 64. His body was returned to Copenhagen for burial. He was buried at Assistens Cemetery in a plot chosen by the Danish jazz community that had adopted him. His grave is a modest stone. It gives his name and his dates, and beneath them, in Danish, the words "en stor musiker," which means a great musician. He is buried thousands of miles from the country of his birth. Almost no American jazz fans ever visit. Danish jazz fans do, sometimes. His grave is quieter than it should be for a man who played on some of Duke Ellington's greatest recordings. Now, let me take us back to the United States for the next stop, because there is a pattern here I want to explore. American musicians who fled to Europe and died there, buried far from home. We travel to Paris now, back to Père Lachaise Cemetery, where we visited Jim Morrison earlier tonight. In another section of the cemetery, in Division 97, lies Sidney Bechet. Sidney Bechet was born in New Orleans on the 14th of May, 1897. He was, along with Louis Armstrong, one of the two great inventors of the modern jazz solo. He played clarinet and soprano saxophone. He was one of the first great jazz virtuosos. He toured Europe in 1919 as part of the Southern Syncopated Orchestra, and he never really felt at home in America again. He came back to the United States several times over the following decades, but Europe felt more comfortable to him. Black jazz musicians were treated with more respect in France than in the American South. His personal problems, which were extensive and included multiple arrests for violent behavior, were also easier to escape by leaving the country. In 1949, at age 52, Bechet moved permanently to France. He lived in the Paris suburbs. He performed at the Vieux Colombier Jazz Club. He was, in his final years, more famous in France than he had ever been in America. Sidney Bechet died in Garches, in the western suburbs of Paris, on the 14th of May, 1959, on his 62nd birthday, of lung cancer. He was buried at Père Lachaise Cemetery in a plot the French jazz community had arranged for him. His grave is a modest stone with a small carved image of a soprano saxophone. American jazz fans who visit Père Lachaise looking for Jim Morrison sometimes wander past Bechet's grave without recognizing it. His name in France is much larger than his name in America. He is buried thousands of miles from New Orleans, from the streets and clubs where he made his name. His remains are in Paris. His musical legacy is scattered across 2 continents. We travel now to Barbados, to a small country cemetery in the parish of St. Michael, on the outskirts of Bridgetown. There is a modest grave here for the singer Jackie Opel, though Jackie Opel is not perhaps famous enough for a tour like this one. Let me redirect once more. Rather than accumulate more graves in this way, let me take us to some of the most important remaining unvisited music graves in America. We are going now to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, to Southeast Louisiana Veterans Cemetery on Kirby Smith Road, and specifically to the grave of a man who was born Jean Vincent Craddock in 1935. and who is buried in Riverside, California, not Louisiana. Let me actually start over on this entry. Gene Vincent, born Vincent Eugene Craddock in Norfolk, Virginia, on the 11th of February, 1935, is buried at Eternal Valley Memorial Park in Newhall, California. He was one of the most electrifying figures in the early years of rock and roll. He recorded Bebop Aaliyah in May 1956, less than a year after Elvis Presley had signed with RCA. Gene Vincent had a hit that reached number 7 on the Billboard chart in the same summer that Elvis's Heartbreak Hotel was rising to number 1. He never had another hit that big. His career declined sharply in the late 1950s. He was involved in a car accident in England in April 1960, along with fellow American rock and roll star Eddie Cochran, who died in the crash. Vincent, who had already had a permanent leg injury from a motorcycle accident in the Navy in 1955, was permanently disabled by the second crash. He lived out his years drinking heavily. He was largely forgotten in America. He toured England and Europe, where he still had a following. He came back to California in the late 1960s. Gene Vincent died of a ruptured stomach ulcer in Newhall, California, on the 12th of October, 1971, at 36 years old. His grave at Eternal Valley Memorial Park is a small flat marker. It gives his name and his dates. It does not mention Bebop Aaliyah. Almost nobody visits. He was, briefly, one of the most important figures in early rock and roll. His name is essentially forgotten in America today. He lies in a modest plot in a valley cemetery in the northern reaches of Los Angeles County. He is one of the loneliest music graves in California. Let me take us to a much more famous grave now, one that receives significant visitor traffic, but that carries a particular sadness. We are going to Los Angeles, to Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Hollywood Hills, to the Courts of Remembrance section. In a private mausoleum crypt, behind a marble wall, lies Nat King Cole. Nathaniel Adams. Coles was born in Montgomery, Alabama, on the 17th of March, 1919. His family moved to Chicago when he was 4 years old. His father was a Baptist minister. Nat played piano from an early age. By 17, he was playing professional jazz in Chicago clubs. He formed the Nat King Cole Trio in 1937. The trio's sound, a piano-guitar-bass combination without drums, influenced dozens of jazz groups for decades. Nat sang, but he considered himself primarily a pianist. He was one of the finest jazz pianists of his generation. His singing career happened partly by accident. A club owner in Los Angeles asked him to sing Sweet Lorraine one night in 1943. The response from the audience was enormous. Nat kept singing more. He signed with Capitol Records in 1943. Over the next 2 decades, he became one of the biggest recording stars in America. The Christmas song, which he recorded in 1946, has been played more times than perhaps any other American holiday song, Mona Lisa in 1950. Unforgettable in 1951, Smile in 1954, Send for Me in 1957. In 1956, NBC gave Nat King Cole his own weekly television variety series. He was the first African-American entertainer to host a network television series, and this happened at a time when major sponsors were still afraid to associate their brands with a black host. The show ran for 13 months and was canceled because Nat could not get a national sponsor. He had reportedly said, "Madison Avenue is afraid of the dark." Cole was a heavy smoker. He smoked at least 3 packs a day. He was diagnosed with lung cancer in 1964. Surgery to remove the tumor was unsuccessful. He died at St. John's Health Center in Santa Monica on the 15th of February, 1965, at 45 years old. His funeral was held at St. James Episcopal Church in Los Angeles. He was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Hollywood Hills in a private crypt in the Freedom Mausoleum. His widow Maria, whom he had married in 1948, was buried beside him when she died in 2012. His daughter Natalie, who had also become a successful singer and who had recorded an electronic duet with her father's voice on Unforgettable in 1991, is buried at Forest Lawn Cathedral City in the Coachella Valley. She died in 2015. The Cole family has been separated by geography and death. Nat and Maria are at Forest Lawn, Hollywood Hills. Natalie is at a different Forest Lawn. His other children have their own lives. His crypt at Forest Lawn is behind a marble wall in the Freedom Mausoleum, which is not fully accessible to the public. You can visit Forest Lawn and see the exterior of the mausoleum, but the crypts inside are only visible to family members. Fans who come looking for him often find only a marble facade. Nat King Cole is one of the most beloved singers in American history. His songs are played every Christmas. His voice is unmistakable. And yet his physical grave is one of the least accessible celebrity graves in Los Angeles, deliberately protected from the fans who would want to see it. We travel next to Detroit, to a place we have already visited twice tonight, Woodmere Cemetery on West 4th Street. Levi Stubbs of the Four Tops is here. And in another section of the same cemetery lies Little Willie John. Little Willie John was born William Edward John on the 15th of November, 1937, in Cullendale, Arkansas. His family moved to Detroit when he was a small child. He grew up in the Belle Isle projects. He started singing gospel in church at 6 years old, and by 15 he was recording for King Records. He was one of the great soul singers of the 1950s. His voice was extraordinary. He recorded Fever in 1956, which reached number 24 on the pop chart. Peggy Lee later covered it in 1958 and had a much bigger hit with it, but the definitive version is Little Willie John's, sung with an intensity and vulnerability that has never been equaled. He also had hits with All Around the World, Suffering with the Blues, and Talk to Me, Talk to Me. His personal life was troubled. He drank heavily. He was volatile. In October 1964, at a party in Seattle, Washington, he stabbed a man named Kendall Roundtree during an argument. Roundtree died the next day. Little Willie John was charged with manslaughter. He was convicted in 1966 and sentenced to 8 to 20 years in the Washington State Penitentiary at Walla Walla. He was 30 years old when he entered prison. He never left. On the 26th of May, 1968, at age 30, Little Willie John was found dead in his cell at Walla Walla. The official cause was pneumonia, though rumors have circulated for decades that he was killed by other inmates or that he died of complications from an untreated heart condition. The prison did not conduct a thorough investigation. His body was returned to Detroit for burial. He is buried at Woodmere Cemetery in a modest plot. His grave is a flat marker with his name and his dates. His brother, the singer Mabel John, was one of the earliest artists signed to Motown Records. She had a modest career and later became a minister. She died in 2022. Little Willie John was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1996, nearly 30 years after his death, based partly on lobbying by James Brown, who had called him one of the finest soul singers of all time. His grave at Woodmere is rarely visited. Detroit has too many important music graves for even the important ones to receive attention. He is one of them. Let us travel now to a much more famous grave. We are going to Nashville, to Woodlawn Memorial Park on Thompson Lane on the south side of the city. This is a large, modern cemetery, and it holds a number of country music graves. George Jones is here. Tammy Wynette is here. Marty Robbins is here. Porter Wagoner is here. Little Jimmy Dickens is here. And in a beautiful marble mausoleum in the middle of the cemetery, in a location that receives significant visitor traffic, lies Jim Reeves. Actually, that is not correct. Jim Reeves is not at Woodlawn in Nashville. He is at his own private memorial park in Carthage, Texas, called the Jim Reeves Memorial Park, which is on U.S. Highway 79 about a mile east of Carthage. Let me correct that. Jim Reeves was born James Travis Reeves on the 20th of August 1923 in Galloway, Texas. He was a semi-professional baseball player before he was a country singer, briefly signed to the St. Men. Louis Cardinals minor league system. A shoulder injury ended his baseball career, and he turned to music. He signed with Abbott Records in 1953 and had a hit with Mexican Joe the same year. He signed with RCA in 1955 and became one of the founding figures of what came to be called the Nashville Sound, a smoother and more pop-oriented approach to country music. His voice was extraordinarily rich and warm. Four Walls in 1957 was his breakthrough. He'll Have to Go in 1960 was his biggest hit, reaching number 2 on the pop chart. Jim Reeves died in a plane crash on the 31st of July 1964 at 40 years old. He was piloting a single-engine Beechcraft Debonair from Batesville, Arkansas to Nashville. Weather was bad. He got disoriented in a thunderstorm and crashed into a wooded area about 10 miles south of Nashville. He and his manager, Dean Manuel, who was flying with him, both died. Their bodies were not found for 2 days. His body was returned to Carthage, Texas, his hometown. He is buried at the Jim Reeves Memorial Park, a small dedicated memorial cemetery about a mile east of Carthage on US 79. His grave has a bronze statue of him in a country western suit. His widow Mary later added a memorial to Dean Manuel next to Jim's plot. The memorial park draws a modest but steady stream of visitors, mostly older country music fans on driving tours through the region. He is one of the few American singers to have a dedicated one-person memorial park. Most singers get a plot in a larger cemetery. Jim Reeves has his own place. And even so, most Americans who ever hummed "He'll Have to Go" have no idea where he is buried. Let us now visit a grave in Tupelo, Mississippi. That is not the grave of Elvis Presley, though Elvis was born in Tupelo. We are going to Priceville Cemetery, on the north side of Tupelo, a small country cemetery, and under a modest headstone, in a plot that most people would never find without asking directions, lies Elvis's stillborn twin brother, Jesse Garon Presley. Jesse Garon was born on the 8th of January, 1935, at 4 a.m., a half hour before his brother Elvis. He was stillborn. Elvis's mother Gladys did not know she was carrying twins. When the first baby was born dead and the second was born alive, she named the living baby Elvis Aaron and the dead baby Jesse Garon. Jesse was buried the next day at Priceville Cemetery, north of Tupelo, in an unmarked pauper's grave. The Presley family could not afford a marker. He remained in an unmarked grave for the rest of Elvis's life. Elvis reportedly visited the site as a child and as an adult. His mother took him there. It was, according to those who knew him, a place of enormous meaning to him. After Elvis's death in 1977, Vernon Presley placed a small marker at Priceville Cemetery for Jesse. It gives Jesse's name and the date of his birth and death, both the same. The marker is a modest granite stone, but here is the strange part. The exact location of Jesse Garon Presley's body has never been definitively established. Priceville Cemetery has been in continuous use since the mid-19th century, and the older records are incomplete. The marker that Vernon Presley placed in 1977 was placed in the approximate location, based on family memory. Whether Jesse's remains are actually beneath that stone, no one can say with certainty. Elvis and Jesse were sometimes described by Elvis's mother as two souls in one body. Elvis, according to family friends, believed for much of his life that his lost twin was somehow with him. Some of his psychic and spiritual interests may have been rooted in this belief. He was known to say, when discussing his relationship with Jesse, that he felt he was living for both of us. Elvis is buried at Graceland in Memphis, more than 100 miles from Tupelo. Jesse Garon is at Priceville Cemetery in Tupelo, in a grave that may or may not contain his remains. The twin brothers are separated in death by more than 100 miles, and Elvis, for all his fame, is buried in a fancy garden behind his mansion, while his twin brother, if that is where his body is in a working country cemetery under a plain stone. The two Presley brothers, born together, buried separately, forever. Let us close our tour tonight with a grave that carries particular weight. We are going to Los Angeles, to Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Hollywood Hills. Nat King Cole is here. Ricky Nelson is here. And in the Sanctuary of Compassion, in a private area within the Court of Remembrance Mausoleum, lies Sammy Davis Jr. Actually, Sammy Davis Jr. is buried at Forest Lawn Glendale, not Hollywood Hills. Let me correct that. He is at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, in the Garden of Honor section, alongside his family. Sammy Davis Jr. was born in Harlem on the 8th of December, 1925. He was performing in vaudeville by the age of 3, in a family act called the Will Maston Trio, with his father and his adopted uncle, Will Maston. He essentially never went to formal school. His whole education was on the road. He served in the Army during the Second World War, where he encountered violent racism that permanently shaped his adult life. He was regularly beaten by white soldiers. His nose was broken. He was pissed on. When he came out of the Army in 1945, he returned to the Will Maston Trio and worked his way slowly up through the black show business circuit. His breakthrough came in the early 1950s. He became a nightclub headliner. Frank Sinatra befriended him. The two of them formed the core of what would become known as the Rat Pack, which was the most powerful entertainment cohort in America in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Sammy Davis was, by consensus, the most talented single performer in that group. He could sing, dance, do impressions, play multiple instruments, act, and do stand-up comedy. Frank Sinatra reportedly said that Sammy was the greatest entertainer he had ever seen. Sammy also lived a life that was frequently controversial. He converted to Judaism in 1961. He married the Swedish actress May Britt in 1960, which was one of the highest-profile interracial marriages of the era. The marriage was met with genuine hatred from parts of the American public, including death threats. Even Frank Sinatra had asked Sammy to postpone the wedding until after the 1960 presidential election because he worried that the marriage might cost John F. Kennedy the presidency. Sammy did postpone it. Kennedy won. Sammy and May married in November 1960 and divorced in 1968. Sammy Davis Jr. died at his home in Beverly Hills on the 16th of May 1990 of throat cancer at 64 years old. He had been diagnosed with the cancer 2 years earlier and had refused surgery that might have removed his larynx because his voice was his instrument. He was a heavy smoker throughout his life. His third wife, Altovise, was with him when he died. He had refused to disclose the seriousness of his illness to the public for as long as he could. His funeral was attended by more than 3,000 people. His body was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale. In a family plot, his father, Sammy Sr., is buried nearby, as is his adopted uncle Will Maston, who had been part of the Will Maston trio with him. The Davis family is together. His grave receives moderate but steady visitor traffic. He is not a modern reference point in the way that Sinatra is. Younger fans often do not know his name. But older fans, and black entertainment historians, and Rat Pack enthusiasts, still make the pilgrimage. His flat marker gives his name and his dates. Below the dates is the phrase, "the greatest entertainer of all time." That is what the marker says. He believed it. Frank Sinatra believed it. And it is not obviously wrong. 30 singers, 30 graves. Or 29, if we count Elvis's separate stillborn twin brother. Or perhaps 31, if we count Nick Drake's tree. Some of them are in graves that are visited every day by fans from around the world. Elvis at Graceland. Aretha at Woodlawn, Detroit, Jim Morrison at Père Lachaise, Nat King Cole at Forest Lawn. Some of them are in graves that are visited by almost nobody. Jimmy Rogers in Meridian, Mississippi, Levi Stubbs in Detroit, Little Willie John in the same cemetery. Buddy Bolden's uncertain grave in New Orleans, Gene Vincent in Newhall, California, Ricky Nelson's cornfield crash site. Some of them are not really in graves at all. Kurt Cobain's ashes scattered in the Wishkah River. Janis Joplin's ashes in the Pacific. Sam Cooke's move from Forest Lawn to Inglewood. Roger Peterson's small plaque in Alta, Iowa, unknown to most of the people who mourned the day the music died. And some of them are in places that are, for one reason or another, kept quiet. Audrey Hepburn's wooden cross in a Swiss village that asks visitors to be discreet. Nick Drake's stone under an oak tree in an English churchyard that his sister asks fans to visit respectfully. Nat King Cole's crypt behind a marble wall that fans cannot enter. The pattern here is not about talent. Almost every singer we visited tonight was one of the great voices of their era. The pattern has to do with luck, family, geography, and marketing. Some singers are kept alive in public memory by heirs who make it their business to do so. Some are protected from public memory by families that want privacy. Some are simply forgotten because no one bothered to remember them, or because the place they were buried is far from the touring routes. What we can do, tonight and every night, is remember them, say their names, play their records. Think about the specific ground where each of them lies, and about the specific circumstances that put them there. Elvis is at Graceland, with his mother and father. Jimmy Rogers is at Oak Grove in Meridian. Nick Drake is under the oak tree at St. Mary Magdalene's. Jim Morrison is at Père Lachaise behind a metal barrier. Audrey Hepburn is at Tolo Chenaz under a wooden cross. Buddy Bolden is at Holt Cemetery in New Orleans, in a grave that may or may not be his own. Levi Stubbs is at Woodmere in Detroit, under a flat stone. Miles Davis is at Woodlawn in the Bronx. Roberta Flack is at Piedmont Memorial Gardens in Winston-Salem. Kurt Cobain's plaque is under a bridge in Aberdeen. Buddy Holly is at Lubbock City Cemetery. Ritchie Valens is at San Fernando Mission. J.P. Richardson is at Forest Lawn, Beaumont. Roger Peterson is at Buena Vista Memorial in Alta, Iowa. Sam Cooke is at Inglewood Park in Los Angeles. Ricky Nelson is at Forest Lawn, Hollywood Hills. Otis Redding is at Wesley Chapel in Randolph County, Georgia. Aretha Franklin is at Woodlawn in Detroit. Janis Joplin is in the Pacific. Ben Webster is at Assistens in Copenhagen. Sidney Bechet is at Père Lachaise in Paris. Gene Vincent is at Eternal Valley in Newhall. Nat King Cole is at Forest Lawn, Hollywood Hills. Little Willie John is at Woodmere in Detroit. Jim Reeves is at his memorial park in Carthage, Texas. Jesse Garon Presley is at Priceville in Tupelo. Sammy Davis Jr. is at Forest Lawn, Glendale. They were, all of them, part of what made the world sing. Some of them left us early. Some of them left us in ways that were painful. But their voices are still on the records. The records are still in the world. Thank you for walking with me. Rest well. And if you pass a cemetery in the coming week, and you have a moment, stop and read a name. Any name. Someone was loved. Once. Who was buried there. It costs us nothing. And it may be the only thing that keeps any of us from disappearing entirely. Good night, friends.